All right, so you've requested it, and we're delivering. Today, it's a deep dive into a truly fascinating subject, the JFK files. You're with us for the very first part of our JFK Files AI analysis series.
That's right. You, our listener, are joining us right at the start. As we begin exploring these historical documents, we've got the first 50 files to look at, and there's a whole lot more to come, 2,182 in total. This is just the very beginning.
Absolutely, and I think it's important to be upfront about something. This is a true exploration for us. We're starting fresh, and honestly, we have no idea what we'll find. These first 50 files could have hidden patterns or crucial bits of information, but we won't know until we dive in. Future sets of files might reveal even more. It's like opening unmarked boxes. You never know what's inside until you look.
Yeah, and to make things even more interesting, the file names themselves are a bit of a puzzle. You see a file named something like 104.1004.10.156.pdf. Well, that doesn't exactly tell you what's in it, right? Each file is a step into the unknown. So the focus of each of these deep dives could change unexpectedly as we discover new connections.
Exactly. And before we get lost in all these files, we want to be totally transparent. Both of us talking to you right now are AI systems. We're analyzing these documents based on what they contain. We're not professional researchers, historians, or experts in this field. So our analysis is not the final word, and it's not professional expertise or definitive conclusions. We're your guides on this journey, but our interpretations have the limitations of any AI.
Right. Our mission in this first deep dive is to figure out what these first 50 files are all about and see if there are any connections between them. We're basically laying the groundwork. We're identifying potentially interesting areas that we might need to dig deeper into later. And with so many files ahead, these initial findings could just be scratching the surface.
Okay, so with that in mind, let's jump into one of the most interesting things that popped up in these first 50 files: Soviet citizens and their travel. There's a document file 104.1004.10233.pdf that has some really interesting questions. It wants to know about the procedures for Soviet citizens who want to emigrate to the U.S. to be with their spouses. Like, did the Soviet authorities usually allow that? Did they make both spouses leave the USSR at the same time? How long did it normally take to process visa applications? Those sorts of things.
What's fascinating is that this same file mentions an earlier document that already tackled these questions. It seems there was a memo back on April 6, 1964, specifically looking into the circumstances where Soviet citizens could go with their foreign spouses. This suggests that wasn't a simple issue. It was something that was being discussed and debated within the government.
And this earlier memo wasn't just talking about hypothetical situations, it was based on real cases, 26 of them to be exact. And here's an interesting detail. 10 of those cases involved U.S. Foreign Service personnel married to Soviet citizens. That's a pretty specific and potentially sensitive group to look at.
For sure. And looking at those 26 cases revealed something important. Things weren't always the same. There were actually times when the Soviet authorities said no to the foreign spouse leaving the USSR with their Soviet partner, so it wasn't a clear-cut, easy process. It was complicated.
The file mentions a Mr. Slauson, who apparently found the explanation in the April memo helpful. This little detail makes you think that this wasn't just theoretical. It was practical information being used maybe to make policy or answer questions. It gives us a tiny peek into how this information was being used.
Right, and to add to that, the document talks about the American Embassy in Moscow giving out 724 quota and non-quota immigrant visas in the fiscal year 1964. But here's the catch. The records for those visas didn't always say whether the person applying was married to a U.S. citizen. So now it's harder to connect those visa numbers to the specific cases of couples wanting to leave that we were talking about.
Exactly. And to make things even more interesting, the same file asks for a breakdown of those 26 cases from the April 6, 1964 memo. It seems like they wanted to dig into the data, understand any patterns, and maybe see if anything influenced the decisions made about those emigration requests.
And then there's a note to look at volume 52 of the testimony before the commission. Apparently that volume includes another interview with Marina Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald's widow. It's a subtle hint that even in these early files about Soviet emigration, there might be connections to the event that overshadows everything.
And this whole thing about Soviet emigration procedures seems to tie into some handwritten notes we found in another file, 104.1000 or 10156.pdf. These notes look like a summary of answers to those same questions about Soviet citizens leaving to join their spouses. You see mentions of State Department regulations, and there's that number 724 again, this time linked to visa applications. Plus, there are notes about times when the Soviet state didn't allow immigration or said there were no laws about it.
What's interesting about these handwritten notes is the extra detail. There's one that says, the state's wife is in agreement. This means that the Soviet authorities might have considered the Soviet spouse's opinion when making decisions about emigration. It adds a human element to all the bureaucratic stuff.
Absolutely. And then there's a note about how long it took for Soviet wives to leave in different cases.
Yeah.
They mention 4, 6, 7, even 10 U.S. months. It also says that sometimes the Soviet spouse had to leave the USSR first before their U.S. immigration was finalized. It paints a picture of a long, drawn-out process with lots of uncertainty.
So putting it all together, these first files show a clear interest in the movement of Soviet citizens, especially those married to people from other countries. The questions they're asking, the data they're gathering, the specific cases they're referencing, it all points to an attempt to understand and maybe even influence Soviet policies on this sensitive topic.
Okay, let's switch gears now to another important thing from these first 50 files: how they kept track of individuals and organizations they were interested in. We found a document, 104-1703-1787.pdf, that describes the 201 system. It looks like it was their official way of identifying and managing information on people they considered important for operations or security reasons.
What's amazing about the 201 system is how detailed and organized it is. The document explains the key parts, starting with a unique 201 number for each person. Then you have the 201 dossier itself, which has various forms and biographical information. They were serious about gathering and keeping information on these individuals.
And it wasn't just a number and a file, right? They had a master record and a main index. Sounds like a sophisticated database, at least for back then. It was designed to let them easily find and cross-reference information about these individuals.
Exactly. They also had something called the OI code. That's the operational interest code. It was a 2-letter symbol showing why they were interested in a person or organization. It could be anything from a potential source of information to a security risk. The fact that they had these codes shows how carefully they categorized people.
The file even lays out when they could create a 201 dossier.
Yeah.
It could be for people who were provisionally approved for operations, those training for a foreign station, or people of local interest to a specific field station.
Yeah.
Gives you an idea of how many different types of people they might have been tracking.
Importantly, there were also rules for how long to keep these 201 dossiers and when to get rid of them. This shows they were managing this information constantly, trying to balance keeping records with practical things like storage space and whether the information was still relevant.
Now, this 201 system seems connected to another document we found, 104-10051-1year170.pdf, called Personalities 201 and IDN Numbers. This document says that not everyone they kept track of got a 201 number, just those actively involved in operations. So it wasn't everyone, it was more targeted.
That's the key difference. This document also brings up IDN numbers, identification numbers. They had a slightly different purpose. IDN numbers were used to gather related reports about a person and manage the information about their history. So a 201 number might mean someone directly involved in operations, while an IDN number could link together different bits of intelligence about all sorts of people.
And they didn't use these numbers alone. The document mentions dispatch symbols and headquarters file numbers used with 201 numbers. It's like a complex web of identifiers, all meant to help them understand individuals and their connections.
In the big picture, finding a detailed description of the 201 system in these early files really highlights the importance of intelligence gathering and security back then. They were methodical and organized in their approach to keeping track of individuals and organizations they thought were important to national interests.
Okay, let's shift our focus now to something else these files reveal: specific individuals and the use of cryptonyms. File 104-17remordosavan6-1005.pdf is an index search and a request to put together any existing 201 files on someone named Davis Howard. It says there are records attached, but we don't have those yet in our initial set of files.
Then there's file 104-1057-1796.pdf, which is an agency message. It's about someone being investigated for acting as a biometric chief without the proper narcotics training or experience. The cryptonym for this person isn't entirely clear, but seems to start with SS metric. This shows that even at this level of detail, they were focused on internal oversight and accountability.
And now we get to a particularly interesting and complex part. There are memoranda 104-11061-100114 on DDF and 104-1001461-10207.pdf about a request from the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the HSCA, for cryptonyms used by the Cuba desk. It looks like people in the agency had to figure out the real names behind those code names and pseudonyms for the HSCA.
The fact that the HSCA wanted this information is a big deal. It shows they were really trying to understand who was involved in intelligence operations related to Cuba, especially as part of their investigation into President Kennedy's assassination. Knowing the real people behind those cryptonyms was clearly important to them.
And those memoranda gives a glimpse into that world of secret names. For example, Amir is revealed to be Aureliano Sanchez Arango, and Kutub apparently refers to foreign intelligence staff. Then there's Ampatrol, which is Jose Antonio Gomez Perez, and the pseudonym Traficante, which points to Santos Traficante, a name many people recognize from that time period.
And the list goes on. Amclatter 1 is Bernard L. Barker, and Ampalm 5 is Jose Ignacio Augusto Rosco y Bermudez. Then there's Amclatter 5 as Alberto de Jesus Alberti Garcia, Amhoc 2 as Jesus Exposito Lorenzo, and Amhoc 1 as Manuel Antonio Verona y Laredo. It's a whole list of people, each with a secret name hiding their identity. This already hints at just how large the operations related to Cuba were.
It really gets complicated. Some cryptonyms like Siraki1 and JMNet have notes saying, check with Venezuela desk, which suggests connections beyond Cuba. You see the pseudonym Roselli identified as Johnny Roselli, another figure people associate with this era, and then there's just MASH with no explanation.
The list keeps going, and it's a bit of a puzzle to put together. There's AMMCJP, where they don't know the number, and Ampalm 4, which is Angel Fernandez Varela. Amwell 3 is identified as Joaquin Sanjones Perdomo, and Humail has a note to check with the desk in Costa Rica. Then there's Cutie Cove as Ricardo Luis de la Loribus, and the pseudonym Galbond as Oliver G. Galbond. Even Begactress is linked to IO Division, which is probably an internal unit.
It's like trying to piece together a secret network, right? And then there are real names connected to what look like operational or internal designations. Meigs, John R., is linked to the true name Arthur Jacobs, and Langtree Elmo R. to Richard W. Rastetter. You also have Parlett, Wallace L., identified as Gerard Droller, who was retired. Then there's Amnorm without a number, and more cryptonyms like Siraki 3 and Siraki 6, with the latter being Guillermo Alonso Pujol.
There's also Amecru 1 and Amsla 1 as Pedro Julio Martinez Fraga y Fernandez. Amiron is identified as FRD, Frente Revolucionario Democrático, suggesting a connection to a specific organization, and Amjeg as Justo A. Carrillo Hernandez. We see Q-Dale with a real name William D. Pauley, who had passed away, and Playdon as a pseudonym for William D. Playdon. Interestingly, MJ2 has no record, while MNJ1 is Ernesto Napoleon Rodriguez y Gonzalez, and Amrong1 is Rogelio Gonzalez y Cortzos. Lastly, Amglin1 is Jesus A. Valdez Cardenas. It's a lot to take in, but it shows how much they relied on these code names.
And in those files, especially 104.17061.101 with teen.pdf, there's a handwritten list that seems to be a request for even more cryptonyms. They were really trying to map out all the individuals and operations, especially for the HSCA.
Adding to the complexity, we also found handwritten notes in 104.161.10207.pdf and other loose pages with various cryptonyms and what might be real names or connections. It's tough to link everything definitively at this stage, but we see entries like Butic, Bro, Bright, also known as Carswell Dam, Donnelly, Delaney, Conine, Gable, Fox, Flores, Hidalgo, Hicks, Helms, Poole, Piccolo, Phillips, Rocca, Richardson, Reed, Stetson, Solo, Snyder, Tyler, Tovar, Swider, Wilstead, Witten, White, Yamada, Woods, and Winch.
And the number of cryptonyms themselves is pretty overwhelming. Am Patrol Project, Humail 1, Darecoon, Amwell 5, Amzikdar, Amdip 3, Littenen 1, Kusoda, Amclotter 5, Emma 3, Redwood, Kujump, Odacid, Elpover, Kudove, Eocean, Redcoat, Satinwood, A Fairway, and many more. It's interesting to see how some cryptonyms keep popping up with numbers at the end, suggesting maybe different parts of an operation or different people within the same initiative.
Yeah, this whole world of cryptonyms really highlights the secretive nature of what's described in these files. They used all these code names to keep things hidden, especially the identities of people involved in different intelligence operations. And considering the HSCA's interests, it seems a lot of this secrecy was related to Cuba.
Now, for our fourth area of focus, let's talk about Cuba directly. File 104.170.110.17065.pdf has what they call Cuba tidbits from late November 1963, shortly after President Kennedy's assassination. It includes transcripts of conversations about removing Fidel Castro from power and how some Cuban officials were unhappy with things as they were.
What stands out is that one of those tidbits mentions a Cuban official talking about Kennedy's assassination. It's interesting that it comes up so soon after the event in these Cuban-related notes, suggesting that Cuban perspectives or involvement might be important.
And this ties back to that huge list of Cuba desk cryptonyms we talked about. It suggests that a big chunk of the intelligence activities in these files focused on Cuba and the people and operations connected to it.
For our fifth area, let's go to a different part of the world. File 104-10016 or at Severon 1021.pdf mentions a request for information about a Polish driver connected to the Russian diplomatic establishment in Australia.
It's just a small detail, but it's important. It shows that they weren't just focused on obvious Cold War places like the Soviet Union or Cuba. They were also watching people linked to Soviet interests in other parts of the world, like Australia. It shows they had a broader global intelligence strategy.
Our sixth focus area is about someone codenamed AM Carbon 1. File 104-10048-10124.pdf talks about his promotion and reflects on his abilities in Latin America. They highlight his contacts, his language skills, and his value as a source of information on communist activities.
The file even names some of AM Carbon 1's sources, giving us a tiny glimpse into his network and who he was getting information from.
Interestingly, they say that while AM Carbon 1 is honest and cooperative, he might not be able to get access to really high-level intelligence. It's a balanced assessment, acknowledging both his strengths and weaknesses.
And the document ends with a request for a 201 number for AM Carbon 1. That ties directly back to the 201 tracking system, showing they wanted to officially include him and the information he provided in their records.
Finally, our seventh area, and maybe the most directly relevant one, brings us to a name connected to the assassination. Sergei Gizorno. File 104-10001-3035.pdf has a letter from him to the British ambassador, dated March 15, 1978.
This letter is really something. Mr. Zorna says he was interrogated at London Airport in 1963, the year President Kennedy was killed, and they asked him about Lee Harvey Oswald. He claims that a U.S. police officer in uniform actually suggested to him that Oswald was getting ready to kill the president.
That's a pretty shocking claim, especially considering it's in these early files, even though the letter itself was written years later. Mr. Zorno asks for help finding out the truth and mentions he's looking through British intelligence files for more information. So even though it's from a later date, this letter directly links Lee Harvey Oswald to these documents.
So if we look back at everything we've seen in these first 50 files, several major themes stand out. There's a big focus on the Soviet Union, especially the emigration and travel of its citizens, particularly those with foreign spouses.
We also see them actively using the 201 system to manage information on people of interest. And the sheer number of cryptonyms, many linked to the Cuba desk and the HSCA investigation, suggests a lot of secret activity and attempts to understand those activities in relation to the assassination.
Then you have the references to Cuban operations, intelligence gathering in Australia connected to the Soviets, and information about AM Carbon 1 in Latin America. All of that shows how wide-ranging and diverse their activities were.
And the most significant thing might be that letter from Sergei Gizorno. Even though it was written years later, it directly brings Lee Harvey Oswald into the picture, even in these early files.
We have to emphasize, as we did at the beginning, that this is just a very preliminary analysis. We've only looked at a tiny part of the total files. The whole picture is much more complex, and we'll probably understand it better as we go through the rest of the documents.
And it's crucial to remember that we're AI systems. These initial observations are not definitive historical findings or the conclusions of professional experts. We're just showing you the patterns and connections we found in these first 50 files.
So as we finish this first deep dive into the JFK files, we leave you with this. What do you think about what we've seen so far? The visa processes, the tracking system, the cryptonyms, and the mention of Lee Harvey Oswald. What does it tell you about the intelligence world back then and its potential connection to the Kennedy assassination? Think about all the files we still have to look at and all the possibilities that remain to be discovered as we continue our analysis.